It was the kind of afternoon where the sunlight cuts too sharply through your windshield, making everything feel too bright, too real. The bag of takeout on the passenger seat smelled like rosemary and garlic, and I'd tucked a linen napkin. Inside, the kind we never used at home anymore. It was stupid, really, an olive branch dressed in herbs and intention. We'd argued the night before. Something small. How I was always on edge lately. How I asked too many questions. I had smiled, nodded, promised to be more relaxed. The words tasted like chalk in my mouth. But still, I woke up early, braided my hair neatly, and picked up his favorite lunch from the French place near the lake. Like if I could just remind him of who I used to be, the version he once said he couldn't live without, maybe he'd meet me halfway. I should have called ahead. But I didn't. When I walked into the lobby of his office, the receptionist barely looked up. She wore peach lipstick and a hollow expression. I gave her a polite smile and tapped twice on the bag of food. "Just dropping this off for Daniel." She nodded. No offer to call him. No small talk. I kept walking. His door was slightly open, just like always. He hated closed doors, said they made people feel trapped. Funny, coming from him. I stopped before I pushed it open. There was laughter, soft, intimate. Not quite vulgar, but private. Like an inside joke shared between two people who didn't care who was listening. She was sitting on the edge of his desk. Her dress was deep red, silk maybe, the color of wine stains and whispered sins. She leaned in close, her hand on his tie, teasing the knot loose like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Her perfume hit me even from the hallway, sweet, expensive, with notes of jasmine and a hint of something sharp underneath. I froze. On the corner of his desk sat the photo from our wedding, the one we took under the old oak tree. I was wearing my mother's veil, and he had kissed my hand like we were in a storybook. She picked it up, studied it, tilted her head like she was judging it as a piece of art, not a moment of someone's life. Then she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, that would have been easier. It was casual, indifferent. And he didn't flinch, didn't defend, just leaned back in his chair, smiling like none of it meant anything, like I didn't mean anything. Stood in the hallway, the takeout bag in my hand suddenly far too heavy. It was as if my body had turned to glass, transparent and breakable. I didn't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding but my face numb. She never saw me. Neither did he. I placed the bag down quietly, just to the side of the door, and I walked away, not a single word. No storming in, no yelling, no scene. Just the quiet, dignified step of a woman who realized she was alone in her own story. I made it back to the car before the first tear fell. Not a sob, just one, hot, silent and furious. The wedding ring on my finger suddenly felt too tight. I twisted it absently, as if it might come off without a fight. It didn't. I sat behind the wheel and watched the mirrored building for a while. The glass catching pieces of the sky, pretending to be honest. A million tiny voices screamed inside me, but on the outside, I was still, frozen. Shock is like that. It wraps you in wool and silence and tells you to be a good girl, just for now. Don't remember driving home, I must have. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the kitchen, the uneaten lunch still on my mind like a bad dream. I reached for my perfume, the one he used to say smelled like spring mornings. I sprayed it on my wrist. Just once. It didn't smell like anything anymore. I stared at myself in the hallway mirror for a long time. My face looked normal, calm even. That was the scariest part. I walked into our bedroom and opened the drawer where we kept the old photos. Our honeymoon, his mother's birthday, the anniversary trip to the lake. So many smiles, so many stage smiles. I held one up, tried to remember what it felt like to be that woman. I couldn't. Something cracked in me that day. Not a break, not yet, but a hairline fracture running deep beneath the surface. The kind that waits in silence, that knows it's only a matter of time. There was a time I laughed with my mouth open, full, loud, and unafraid of being too much. That version of me feels like a myth now. someone I once knew only in memory, or maybe only imagined. I met Daniel on a humid September night at a gallery opening I almost skipped. My students had worn me out that day. Sixth graders with smudged hands and bright eyes painting joy with abandon. I showed up late, still wearing the stained apron I hadn't realized I had on under my coat, smelling vaguely of turpentine and chalk. He found that endearing. "You look like you belong in another century," he'd said, smiling like he was already seeing the story we could become. I laughed. I was flattered, and something in me softened. It had been a while since someone looked at me like I was made of wonder instead of work. Back then, I had an attic full of canvases and sketchbooks. My days were color and motion, and my nights were soft jazz and candlelight, wine-stained fingers and ideas I couldn't paint fast enough. He called me mysterious, said I had wild eyes. He made me feel seen. At first, but love, real or counterfeit, has a way of negotiating the self. The first changes were small, dressed as compliments. "You're beautiful, but that lipstick is a little loud for dinner with my boss." Or, "That jacket? It's cute, but maybe something sleeker for the event next week." He framed it as preference, never demand, and I wanted to please him. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could still be myself in softer tones and pencil skirts. Next came the friends. "Lisa's always so negative. I think she brings you down," he said one night after a brunch where she dared to ask me how I really was. Not how Daniel was, not when we'd be having kids, just me. I didn't call her after that. Others followed. Women I had shared my youth with. Bonfire nights, whispered secrets, stolen road trips. One by one, I let the connections fade. He didn't tell me to cut them off. He didn't need to. I was learning to anticipate his approval the way a dancer learns the floor. Then came the art. "It's a beautiful hobby," he said once, brushing dust from a canvas with a casual flick. "But don't you think you're wasting your talent? You're so good with people. You should be doing something more impactful." I stopped painting. The attic became a ghost room. The kind you forget to dust because you're too ashamed of the things that live in it. I locked the trunk of sketchbooks. Let the easel collect cobwebs. I buried the part of me that created without permission. In return, he gave me stability. A house with clean lines and neutral walls. Dinner parties where I played the gracious wife. Vacations I didn't choose but smiled through. He liked when I wore soft pastels, said they made me look elegant. He bought me a perfume one Christmas, something floral and faint. I tried to love it, even though I preferred the one that smelled like sandalwood and storms, the one he said made me smell like a child playing dress-up. My sister noticed before I did. "You don't laugh the same anymore," she told me one summer. We were drinking iced tea on my back porch, cicadas buzzing like static. I shrugged. Told her I was just tired. I was always tired. People think abuse has to be loud, bruises and shouting and slammed doors. But there are softer forms of erasure. Daniel never raised his voice. He never had to. He was reasonable. That was the worst part. He made me feel irrational for wanting to keep parts of myself, for missing the messy joy of oil paint under my fingernails, for wanting nights without schedule or performance. Every desire I held became an inconvenience in his narrative of our life. We got married in early spring, under a cherry blossom. Tree in bloom. Everything looked like a dream someone else was having. I wore a dress that didn't quite feel like mine, and walked toward a future that had quietly rewritten me. On our honeymoon in Italy, I bought a leather-bound sketchbook from a street vendor in Florence. I promised myself I would fill it. It's still in my closet drawer, empty. Sometimes I open it just to touch the pages. By our second anniversary, I had stopped correcting people when they assumed I didn't work. Daniel introduced me as someone who used to be an artist with a chuckle, like I'd grown out of it. I'd smile, nod, sip my wine. At night, when he was asleep beside me, I'd stare at the ceiling and whisper apologies to a version of myself I'd abandoned. I told her I was trying, that this was what love looked like, that security was worth the quiet ache. But security, it turns out, is a fragile thing when it's built on disappearing pieces of yourself. And now, standing in the ruins of what we called a marriage, I can finally name the feeling I carried for years. Hunger. Not for food. Not even for love. For myself. The version of me that danced barefoot to Nina Simone. That cried at movies and didn't care who saw. The woman who created worlds in watercolor and wore red lipstick just because it made her feel brave. She didn't die, she was just buried. And I think maybe she's waking up. A week passed in a haze. The kind where mornings blur into evenings and even your own reflection looks like someone else's life. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen that Tuesday. I didn't scream or accuse or even bring it up at first. I think I was still hoping I was wrong, even though I knew I wasn't. That red dress, the way she had perched on his desk like she belonged there, kept appearing behind my eyes when I closed them at night. That laugh, faint, amused, cruel in its indifference, looped in my ears like a skipping record. It took me 7 days to work up the nerve. We were in the kitchen, quiet but not uncomfortable. That was our specialty after all, polished silence. I was making tea. Daniel was scrolling on his phone, eyes barely acknowledging my presence. His tie was loosened, the same tie she'd touched. I cleared my throat. "Daniel," I said gently, almost childlike, "who was the woman at your office last week?" He didn't even look up, just kept scrolling. "What woman?" he asked flatly. I hesitated. "The one sitting on your desk. She was laughing, touching your tie." His thumb paused over the screen. "Oh, her," he said, like he'd just remembered someone unimportant. "Just a client. You really shouldn't jump to conclusions. It's not attractive." That last word sliced more than the rest. Not true, not fair, not even okay. Just attractive. As though my entire emotional landscape should be filtered through the lens of whether or not it pleased him. "I'm not jumping to anything," I said, softer now, as if that would help. "I saw the way she looked at you, the way you looked at her." He looked up at last, eyes cool, bored. "You're being paranoid," he said. "It's always the same with you. You twist things, imagine things. Maybe you should talk to someone." It was the kind of manipulation that had worked before. That used to make me doubt myself. But this time, something resisted. Still, I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I nodded, said nothing more, and walked upstairs. That night I couldn't sleep. The walls of our home felt tighter, like the glass was beginning to crack, and I was the only one who heard it. 2 nights later, I found it. I wasn't even looking for anything, just tidying the kitchen while Daniel showered. A thin envelope carelessly left on the counter, his bank statement. I should have respected his privacy, but something made me pause. That whisper again. That instinct I'd trained myself to ignore. I unfolded it. Page after page of charges I didn't recognize. $600 at a high-end boutique I'd never heard of. $740 at a jewelry store. $312.98 at a hotel downtown. Not the one we'd stayed at for our anniversary. And then the kicker. Multiple transfers. All from our shared savings account into one under his name only. Over $40,000 gone. Gone from the account I had built by selling the last piece of land my grandmother left me. The field where I learned to paint under an open sky. The money I'd meant to use to build a studio. The money he said we should save for the future. My legs gave out beneath me. I sat right there on the cold kitchen floor, the envelope still in my hands. When he came downstairs later, I had already tucked the paper away. He kissed the top of my head, murmured something about meetings and stress, and went to bed. I sat in the dark until the clock blinked past 2 a.m. Then I rose, walked quietly to the bathroom, and shut the door behind me. The floor was freezing through my pajama pants. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I didn't care. I opened the linen closet and pulled out the wedding album. It was tucked behind the extra towels, buried like a secret I hadn't wanted to face. I flipped it open, and let the pages fall where they may. Daniel's face grinned up at me from photo after photo, charming and polished. My own expression was harder to read. There was joy, yes, But there was also something else, tightness around the eyes, the smile of a woman trying hard to look like she belonged in that dress, like she deserved the ring he'd placed on her. Finger? I ran my hand over the picture where we kissed beneath the archway of flowers. The ink was smooth. The moment had felt permanent, but permanence, I'd learned, was a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. In another photo, my hand rested on his chest. The ring caught the light, a ring I hadn't taken off in nearly 5 years. I slipped it off now. It came loose too easily. I held it in my palm for a long while, just staring. It looked heavier in the photos. On my skin, it felt small, meaningless. Still, I didn't cry. It was strange. I expected tears. I expected rage. But what I felt was quieter than that. Emptier. As if I had been hollowed out and the only thing left was silence. But in that silence, something stirred. Something soft. Something small. But something real. A voice, barely audible beneath the wreckage, whispered, "This is not the end." The next morning, I made breakfast like usual. Eggs, toast, black coffee. I smiled when he came downstairs because that's what I'd always done. Played the part. He didn't notice anything had changed, but everything had. He left for work at 8:15. I watched his car disappear around the corner, then I walked to our bedroom and opened my suitcase. Not to pack, not yet, just to open it, to feel the space waiting for me. I left before the birds began to sing. The house was quiet, the way it always was in those dead hours between night and morning, where regret whispered loudest and shadows stretched longest. I didn't slam the door. I didn't write a note. I simply closed it behind me, soft and slow, as if to keep from waking the version of myself who still believed in him. I took one suitcase. Not the nice one Daniel had picked out for our trip to Venice that never happened, but the scuffed brown one I'd used in college. Soft leather, worn corners. Inside it, 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans, a few underwear. My old camera, tucked. In its velvet pouch, a bottle of the perfume he once said made me smell like a child. I brought it anyway. For spite, maybe, or memory. And the photo, my grandmother. Black and white, her back straight, her gaze forward. She had been widowed. Young, raised 3 children in a house with a leaky roof and a crooked porch. I always thought she looked like defiance in pearls. I took her photo with me because I didn't feel strong yet, but I needed to remember that strength was something women inherited, even if it skipped a generation or two. I didn't tell Daniel I was going. I didn't think he'd notice right away. The sky was still bruised with night as I pulled out of the driveway, watching our house shrink in the rearview mirror. That house, so full of mirrors and polished floors, of matching dinnerware and empty silences, looked like a showroom, more than a home. It had reflected only what he wanted to see. I drove until the city gave way to fields, then to trees, then to ocean. The cabin was small, with walls that creaked in the wind and windows that caught the scent of pine. It stood just outside a coastal town I had visited once when I was 8, on a family vacation filled with sunburns and jellyfish stings. I hadn't remembered it clearly, just the feeling of running barefoot on wet sand, of being too young to worry about anything but how cold the water was. It felt like the right kind of forgotten place. No one asked questions when I signed the rental under my maiden name. The woman at the front desk just nodded and handed me the key. There were no mirrors in the cabin. None. Not in the bathroom, not above the mantel, not behind any closet door. At first I found it odd, but soon I realized how grateful I was. I wasn't ready to see myself yet. Not this new version, not the tired eyes or the mouth that forgot how to smile. I needed time. Days fell into rhythm like waves hitting shore. I walked each morning along the cliffs. The salt air cleared the rust from my lungs. I took deep, greedy breaths like someone relearning how to live. My phone stayed off. No calls, no texts, no pings to remind me of the world I'd left behind. I found a job at a small bookstore tucked between a cafe and a thrift shop. It smelled of dust and vanilla and stories waiting to be remembered. The owner, an older woman named Cora, hired me on the spot after I complimented her earrings. "Dead husband left me with too many bills and not enough conversation," she said, sliding a ledger across the counter. "You seem quiet, that's good. Quiet people don't scare off customers." She baked scones on Tuesdays and brought them in still warm. We didn't talk much at first, just shared the space. It felt like something holy. This kind of silence. It took a week before I unpacked the paints. They had been buried at the bottom of my suitcase, tubes half dried, brushes warped. The canvas I bought was too stiff, the bristles too frayed. But my hands remembered, clumsily, then more surely. The first strokes were ugly, honest. I didn't paint flowers or landscapes or women draped in sadness like silk. I painted a cracked ring, a house swallowed by vines, a woman standing at the edge of the sea with her face turned away. I painted what I couldn't say out loud. Some nights I cried, not the kind of tears that crash, but the ones that seep slowly, unexpected. Once while folding laundry, once while brushing my teeth, once while holding the wedding photo I'd brought by accident, tucked behind my grandmother's in the suitcase. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't throw it away. So I burned it. It was a cold night. I lit a fire in the pit behind the cabin and fed the photo to the flame, watched our frozen smiles curl into ash, Daniel's hand around my waist, my veil catching the light, gone in seconds. Smoke rose like a sigh from the past. It didn't feel triumphant, but it felt necessary. I started wearing my perfume again. The one he said made me childish. I wore it to the bookstore, to the cliffs, to the grocery store where no one knew my name. I wore it because it reminded me of the girl I had been before compromise. Once a little girl in the bookstore looked up and said, "You smell like fairy stories." I almost cried then, but I just smiled. I was still broken in places, still quiet, still unsure of what came next, but I was surviving. And survival, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the soft sound of paint on canvas. Sometimes it's saying your own name in the mirrorless dark and realizing you still believe. Cool. Time has a strange way of folding in on itself when you're healing. Days blurred at first. The rhythms were small: wake, breathe, walk, write, sleep. But within those rhythms, something real began to grow, like roots curling quietly beneath frost-bitten soil. I started carrying my camera again, not for art, not yet, just as a witness. I took photos of cracked shells by the shore, of my hands covered in paint, of rain pooling in the grooves of a forgotten bench. I didn't know why I was collecting them. I just needed to see proof that I was here, that I was real. The cabin I rented had no mirrors. I didn't realize that at first. I'd gone a week without seeing my own reflection, and strangely, I didn't miss it. It felt right. Like the universe agreed that I wasn't ready to look at myself just yet, but I did write. At first it was scribbles in the margins of an old sketchbook, then full pages, then paragraphs typed at night while the sea wind howled outside. I called the blog Salted Earth. I used a pseudonym, Clara A., an echo of my grandmother's name. I never expected anyone to read it, but they did. Women wrote back. One said, "I thought I was crazy until I found your words." Another, "I haven't painted. 6 years. I did last night, thank you." Each message lit something inside me, a quiet warmth, a sense of being less alone, like the pieces of myself I thought had died were finding their way home through the stories of strangers. Then, one afternoon, I opened my inbox and found a message with no subject line, no name, just attachments, screenshots, dozens. I didn't want to open them at first. My fingers hovered over the mouse, trembling, but I did. The woman in red, just one of many. Photos, messages, receipts, private chat logs, all damning. All time-stamped, and then, worst of all, a spreadsheet, transfers, passwords, notes he'd kept. About me, about how to keep her out of the money trail and let her spiral. She always calms down eventually. I stared at the screen for Nearly an hour, breathless. It wasn't just cheating, it was theft. It was manipulation so cold, so calculated, I felt physically ill. I walked outside and threw up behind the hydrangeas, and when I came back inside, I didn't scream. I didn't sob. I opened the drawer where I'd hidden the last check from my grandmother's untouched inheritance, and I called a private investigator. Her name was Lydia, and she was everything I wasn't. Sharp, composed, meticulous. She believed me instantly. She'd seen worse, she said, but not often. Within a week, she had more than enough, more accounts, more receipts, a pattern stretching back years. I hired a lawyer the following day. One afternoon, after mailing the preliminary divorce filings, I found myself staring at my stack of paintings. I hadn't looked at them as a whole before. Some were bright and jagged, others muted and soft. None were perfect, but they were true. I remembered a local gallery was doing an open call for emerging artists. On a whim. No, not a whim. On instinct, I submitted 5 pieces. I didn't tell anyone. 2 weeks. Later I got the email. You've been selected for our fall showcase. We can't wait to feature your work. I read the line again and again. For a long time, I just sat there on the floor, holding the printed letter against my chest, breathing like I was learning how again. I remembered that old photo, my grandmother, standing tall beside her kiln, hands covered in clay, hair wild from the sea air. I had taken it down from the wall months ago when things began to fall apart. I hung it back up that day. I lit a fire in the pit out back and I burned the photo of Daniel and me from our wedding day. The one where my smile looked stiff, tired, too perfect. I watched it curl into ash. The night of the opening, I wore a dress. I never would have before. Deep wine red satin with an open back. The kind that says, I am here, without apology. I fastened my grandmother's brooch at the collar. I wore no perfume, only sea salt in my hair and truth on my skin. Cora came with me, quiet as always, but eyes gleaming with pride. The gallery lights were warm, golden. My work hung on white walls like memory itself. I stood in the corner for a while, watching people drift toward my paintings, tilt their heads, lean closer. A woman with silver hair paused in front of one and whispered, "This one feels like grief, but hopeful." I wanted to hug her. Instead, I smiled. A man asked if I took commissions. A teenager asked if I taught classes. No one knew me as his wife. No one knew about the red dress or the bank statements. I wasn't a woman shattered. I was a woman reframed. When I got home that night, I poured a glass of wine and set up my tripod. I took a photo of myself, standing barefoot by the window. The moon behind me, the brooch at my throat, my eyes calm. That was the photo I printed, framed, and mailed to Daniel's office. No note, no explanation, just that image of the woman he couldn't break, the woman who had chosen her own frame. The city felt unfamiliar beneath my feet, like a place I used to dream in before I knew the sound of silence. I parked a few blocks from the courthouse, choosing to walk. The cold air carried the scent of bus exhaust, wet stone, and something sharp. Anticipation, maybe. Or closure. I wore the same brooch from my gallery opening. I pinned it to the lapel of a fitted black coat, one my mother had once told me made. He looked too serious. I liked that now. I wanted to be taken seriously. Finally, Lydia met me on the courthouse steps, clipboard in hand, her smile steady. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. I had already filed the paperwork weeks ago, the divorce, the financial misconduct claims, the evidence of fraud. This was the hearing. Inside, the room felt sterile, too bright, like a hospital pretending to be a place of justice. Daniel sat across from me, jaw tight, wearing a suit I'd picked out for him 3 years ago. I remembered the day, how he'd kissed my cheek after I adjusted his tie in the mirror, calling me his lucky charm. That tie looked like a noose now. The woman in red sat 2 rows behind him. Her lipstick was gone, her face drawn. I didn't hate her. I pitied her. She was still inside the lie I had finally escaped. The judge was an older woman, eyes clear and voice sharp. My lawyer spoke first, then Lydia, Then the financial expert she'd brought in to review the documents, every transfer, every hidden account, every manipulation. Screenshots printed in color, text messages from him, including the ones about letting her spiral. His lawyer tried to interrupt. Daniel tried to speak. "He's lying," he said, gesturing toward Denise. She's doing this for revenge. She's always been dramatic." The judge held up a hand. Silence returned, heavy and holy. "Mr. Langford, the evidence is not only convincing, it is overwhelming. This is not about drama. This is about documented financial abuse, breach of marital trust, and intentional misappropriation of funds that were never solely yours. You will repay the full amount with interest plus damages." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It was only when I heard the sound of his chair scraping back, shaky, angry, that I realized it was over. The woman, Red, turned toward me as we filed out. "I didn't know," she whispered. I nodded once. "I believe you." And then I left her in the hallway, her mascara smudged, her world beginning to unravel like mine once had. Later that afternoon, I went to the office where he used to work. The receptionist didn't recognize me at first. "Hi," I said, smiling gently. "Can you please give this to Daniel Langford? He'll know what it means." She took the envelope without question. Inside, it was the photograph I had taken of myself, the one in front of my gallery show, light in my eyes, brooch glinting like a blade. On the back I had written in looping script, "This is the woman you tried to break, and that was it." I turned. I walked out. I didn't look back. When I returned to the cabin, the wind had shifted. Spring was whispering through the trees, tentative, but present. I unpacked slowly, carefully placing each item where it belonged. The camera on the shelf, the brooch in a velvet box, the court papers in a folder I hoped never to open again. That night, I stood by the fire pit and pulled out the wedding album once more. Page by page, I studied the faces. Mine, his, the people, who had clapped and cheered and toasted to our forever. Didn't feel sorrow this time. I felt distance, like I was watching a scene from a play I had once acted in, but no longer remembered the lines. I placed the album back in its box and slid it under the bed. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed to be seen. A week passed, then two. And one morning, as I sipped tea by the window, a letter arrived. A real one. Handwritten. It was from a woman named Anna. She had found salted earth. Her handwriting was slanted and rushed. "You don't know me, but I wanted to thank you. I left my husband last night. I didn't think I had the strength until I read your words. You gave me that." I read it 3 times, my eyes soft but dry. Then I folded the letter and slipped it into the back of my journal. Later that night, I wrote my final entry. They took my photo as a joke. Now they frame it in fear. And I live freely in the light. I am not what they tried to make me. I am the woman in the photograph.